Hello, listener. The fact you hear this means you're alive. If you're new here, consider subscribing and comment below where you're listening from. Let's begin the story. My name is Malcolm Kane. Before everything fell apart, I fixed other people's problems, wires, panels, and crumbling brick walls. I worked for the city as a maintenance tech, the guy they called when a streetlight died, a breaker kept tripping, or a 100-year-old building started buzzing the wrong way. Most days were simple enough. I drove a white truck, logged my jobs on a tablet, and hauled the same heavy tool bags up way too many flights of stairs. My beat covered the older part of town and the ragged edges around it. If a church bell jammed, I was the one climbing up to check the motor and the cables. If the lights on the hill road went out in the dead of winter, I was the one out there on a ladder while everyone else complained from inside their heated cars. It wasn't hero work. It was a lot of reset, replace, tighten, and test, then move on to the next ticket. The church on the edge of town showed up on my list twice a year. The building sat by itself past a row of houses and a closed gas station with a narrow access road and an empty field on one side. The main sanctuary never interested me much. My work was in the tower rising above it, sheer stone walls that offered no grip on the outside, housing the bell frame, wiring, and service lights. I knew every turn of those spiral stairs, every low beam you had to duck under, and exactly which steps creaked when you put weight near the rail. Back then, the tower was just another line item on my schedule. I went up, checked connections, noted the rust, and told myself I'd push for a repair order when the city budget looked less miserable. I never thought it would end up being the one place in town I trusted more than my own house. News about the sickness started the way everything did back then, as a headline people scrolled past while they waited for their morning coffee. It was just a bad flu, a story about a few crowded hospitals, and a reminder to wash your hands and stay calm. The first week, nobody I knew changed a thing. Work orders still came in on the tablet. I still climbed poles and icy stairs. Rhea still sat over architectural plans at the kitchen table, a red pencil tucked into her hair, worrying about deadlines that wouldn't matter in a month. Winter made the city feel smaller and tighter. Snow narrowed every street, and the plows pushed slush into gray, frozen ridges along the curbs that turned into black ice by sunset. People kept their heads down, went from their heated cars to their front doors as fast as they could, and blamed the brutal season for every cough they heard in line at the grocery store. It was easy to pretend the news was happening somewhere else, just another tragedy for another town. The first time I heard anything that didn't sound like background noise, I was in the truck between calls. The radio host cut a song short and mentioned unusual violent behavior in a county hospital 2 towns over, then went straight to commercials like it was nothing. By the end of that shift, I'd already forgotten the details. The roads were treacherous, a light on the bridge had shorted out, and my world was still measured in checklists, spare fuses, and overtime hours. Rhea was glued to the news more than me. She had a laptop open most nights and a bad habit of reading headlines out loud when something bothered her. One night, she tapped the screen and said they were locking down whole wards now, not just individual rooms, and added that this didn't happen for a regular flu season. I told her hospitals liked to overdo it because it kept the liability lawyers happy, and I went back to sorting the work phone for the morning. She didn't argue, but she didn't look convinced either. By the end of that week, the nature of my work calls changed. There were fewer reports of burned-out streetlights and more notes from dispatch about people acting strange or hazards on the roadway. At first, I thought someone was typing the wrong codes into the job system. Then I rolled up to a side street by the river where a pickup truck had knocked down a utility pole. The patrol car on the scene had its lights spinning, painting the snow red and blue, but no siren. An officer met me halfway, told me to fix it fast if I could, and kept his eyes locked on something over my shoulder the whole time. While I checked the base of the splintered pole, I heard shouting from farther down the block. A woman's voice came first, sharp and panicked, followed by a man's, low and broken like he couldn't quite catch his breath. The officer turned his radio up and the static cut through the cold air. A dispatcher said, Advise all units to avoid close contact. Repeat, avoid physical restraint if there are bites involved. The word stuck harder than the rest. Bites. Not cuts from a bottle, not injuries from a fall on the ice. Bites. That night, Rhea and I ate standing up at the kitchen island, too tired to sit. She brought up the same word and said they were calling them bite cases now. People who got violent and later claimed they didn't remember anything after the first hit, and that some of them didn't stay down when they should have. I asked where she'd read that. She named a local station and a reporter I'd seen at city council meetings, then added 2 major news outlets that usually talked about storms and elections, not street fights. None of it sounded like just rumors anymore. The city started using phrases like civil unrest in the alerts that lit up our phones. Transit ran on reduced holiday schedules even though it was Tuesday. One of the elementary schools shut down midweek out of an abundance of caution and never opened its doors again. At the maintenance yard where we kept the trucks, guys were swapping stories in the break room between shifts. A cousin who worked at the hospital said security had started locking interior doors from the inside. Someone else said 2 cops on the north side had discharged their weapons inside an apartment building and still called for backup after the shooting stopped. The first clear sign for me wasn't dramatic. It was a work order that didn't make any sense. A flag came in for repeated outages on the same block where the church sat. I knew the lines out there. They were old but not faulty, and the snow that week hadn't been heavy enough to take them down. I drove out anyway. Half the houses were dark, but not from a grid failure. Curtains were drawn tight, cars sat heavy in driveways, and there were no tire tracks in the fresh snow leading to the street. At the corner store near the church road, a hand-painted sign hung crooked in the window. No cash, no change, no bathroom, no entry after dark. The door was locked tight, even though the hours stenciled on the glass said open. Someone had screwed a sheet of plywood over the side window from the inside. When I killed the truck engine, the quiet outside felt wrong in a way I couldn't write off as normal winter stillness. It was a heavy, dead silence. Rhea called while I was idling there and asked where I was. I told her I was out by the old church and said a lot of houses looked shut in. She let out a shaky breath and said they were telling people on the news that if you could stay home, you should. Not just sick people, everyone. I looked up at the bell tower cutting against the gray sky and told her some of us still had keys to use, then promised I'd finish my list and head straight home. I didn't know it then, but that was the last normal day I worked a full route, and the last time I'd see that street empty instead of filled with the dead. 2 days after that quiet drive past the church, the city stopped pretending it had control. The alerts on my phone switched from warnings about icy roads and late buses to urgent messages telling people to stay inside, avoid crowds, and wait for instructions. Sirens went from being a rare nuisance to a constant wailing background track. Rhea was parked at the counter with her laptop open and a full mug of coffee going cold by her hand. The news showed brawls in supermarket aisles, ambulances lined up 3 deep outside hospitals, and glass doors taped off with yellow caution tape while squad cars blocked the entrances. A doctor on the screen talked in a level, monotone voice about patients who still moved after they should have been gone. He never actually said the word dead, but we both heard it loud and clear anyway, and Rhea said they were talking about people who got back up after their hearts stopped. The city pushed a new alert about emergency shelters opening up at the high schools and the hockey arena. They wanted people out of small apartments and herded into big rooms where they could line them up and check for fever bites and bandages. On paper, that sounded safe enough. On the screen, it looked like too many warm bodies in tight spaces, all trusting a handful of exhausted staff not to miss a single infection. Our lights flickered, came back on, then cut out again and stayed dark long enough to feel wrong. I checked the buildings across the street. Some still glowed with emergency power, others were blacked out like us. My work phone buzzed on the table, vibrating against the wood. The message from dispatch was 5 words: stay home. No field response. That was how my routes ended, with a line of text and 0 follow-up. Rhea closed the laptop with a snap and asked if I thought the shelters were safe. I told her I thought they were crowded, and crowded was the last thing I wanted if this thing spread through bites and blood. She looked at me and said if things kept sliding the way they were, a second-floor apartment with one thin door and neighbors on every side was a bad hill to die on. I couldn't argue with that, and I knew the one structure in this town I trusted more than our building. I ran through the places I knew the way I used to build a workday in my head. The yard at work had a chain-link fence and a garage, but it sat right off a busy road with a gate motor that always froze in wet snow. The water plant had thick walls but low ground and too many blind corners. The old church on the edge of town sat alone past a short row of houses and a closed gas station, with an open field on one side and a single narrow road in. More importantly, its tower was sheer stone. No gutters, no fancy brickwork for fingers to grab, just smooth slate rising 40 feet up. It had one service door, one spiral stair, and walls thick enough to shrug off a sledgehammer. And I had the key in my bag. Rhea watched my face and finally asked what I wasn't saying. I told her about the church, the tower, and the spare key, and said I trusted that building more than any high school gym packed with panic-stricken strangers. She looked at the window, where the red and blue lights of sirens kept rolling past in waves, and said if we were going to move, we should go now, before the streets filled with stalled cars and people who had nowhere else to run. That was all the permission I needed. We packed like we were leaving for a long shift and might not come back. Heavy coats, hats, gloves, and boots, 2 blankets tied tight with cord, a box of canned food, a bag of rice, and a jar of peanut butter. I grabbed my basic tools, a hammer, a short pry bar, and a heavy coil of cord. Rhea added a first aid kit, some pills, bandages, and her notebooks and pencils. We filled 2 backpacks and 1 duffel bag. If it didn't fit, it stayed behind. We stayed off the main road and cut through the back streets. I led us between alleys and small vacant lots, using the same shortcuts I took when I needed to reach the hill fast for a late call. The snow back there was cleaner, undisturbed. Near the closed gas station by the church road, we saw our first climber. It was just a shape at first, then a body that vaulted a low chain-link fence without breaking stride and ran along a row of concrete wheel stops. When it hit a patch of ice, it went down hard, rolled, and came up on hands and feet in one fluid motion. Its head stayed locked on something farther up the road. It never turned toward us. We stayed hunkered behind a delivery truck and waited until the crunch of its boots faded into the wind. The church came into view the way it always had on my service days. Plain walls, pitched roof, and the tower rising grim and silent from one side. The lot was empty. One car sat crooked near the side door with snow piling up on the open driver's seat. No light showed through any window. From a distance, it looked dead. To me, it looked ready. We crossed the last stretch at a trot, watching every angle, scanning the tree line. I unlocked the side service door with the same key that had always stuck in winter and yanked it open. Cold, stale air flowed in behind us. The main hall lay to the right, wide and dark, rows of benches and tall glass facing the lot. I didn't slow down to study it. Straight ahead, the tower door waited, plain metal with chipped paint and a push bar. I closed and deadbolted the service door, then opened the tower door and led the way up. The spiral stairs were as narrow and steep as I remembered. Our packs dragged at our shoulders, scraping the stone. Our breathing bounced off the walls. Halfway up, Rhea stopped and rested a hand on the cold stone. She said solid walls and one path up felt like better odds than anything else we had out there. I told her height and tight steps gave us a chance, as long as we didn't waste it. We picked a small landing 2 levels below the bells as our first spot. It had a level floor, enough room for 2 people to sleep, and a narrow slit window facing the road. We found a stack of rough planks in the corner, leftovers from some forgotten repair job, and wedged them tight against the opening ourselves. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. We could peek through the cracks to check outside, but no light would leak out to give us away. We dropped our packs, pulled off our gloves, and stood still listening. There were no footsteps on the stairs below, just the wind whistling around the tower and a low hum from a city that was starting to lose its fight. That first night in the tower, we didn't sleep much. We split one small meal, kept our jackets on, and took turns sitting by the top of the stairs, counting every sound in the dark. The climb from the street to that landing wasn't far in feet, but it felt like we had already left our old life somewhere far down on the ground. Morning in the tower didn't feel like a fresh start. It felt like we had survived one bad roll of the dice and now had to decide exactly what to fix before the next one came up. The first gray light filtering through the cracks in our boarded-up window showed fresh snow covering the old tracks, no moving cars, and no one scraping ice off windshields. The town looked frozen in place, like someone had hit pause on the whole world. Before we even talked about food or sleep, we checked what stood between us and the ground. The tower door at the bottom was solid enough for normal life, but it had been built for code compliance and quick exits, not for keeping determined people out. It was just metal skin over a hollow frame, a push bar, and one standard lock. It would keep out a drunk or a confused kid, but not a group, and definitely not for long. I told Rhea we needed more than that. The architecture was still in our favor, though. We had one narrow spiral stair, one line of travel, thick stone walls, and no low windows to worry about. Even if someone managed to breach the main church, they still had to find the tower door, break through it, and take each step one at a time. Our job was to make every inch of that progress slow, painful, and expensive. We started with what was already there. The service level above the base held a couple of old storage cabinets, a rusted metal shelf, and a short, heavy table. Working together, we dragged the table to the top of the stairwell, then wrestled it down until it sat at the very bottom of the spiral with its legs braced hard against the stone wall opposite the door. The geometry worked. If the door lock failed, anything coming through would meet the table next and have to shove all that dead weight uphill against the friction of the stone. Rhea circled the setup, eyes scanning clearances the way she used to on construction sites. She tapped the wall with her knuckle and said the stone would take more force than the door hinges ever could, then told me we should treat the first turn of the stairs like a second door. She said if you control that curve, you control everything above it. We paced it out, 10 steps from the door to the first turn, 8 more up to the landing we had claimed as ours. I pictured someone forcing the door and trying to run up. They would have to duck under the low stone beam, grab the rail for balance, and shift their weight right at that bend. That was the choke point where we could slow them down. I took a cabinet door off its hinges without much of a fight. I drilled through it with the small hand drill from my bag, then used a masonry bit to pilot holes into the mortar joints on either side of the stair at hip height. I sank 2 long screws into the wall so the head stuck out just enough. The door panel slid over them like a removable bar. If we had to, we could drop it across the inside of the curve in seconds and block most of the width of the stair. Up on our landing, we built the next line of defense. The landing had a steel pipe railing along the open side. I wrapped heavy cord around it and tied 2 solid loops, then put matching anchors into the opposite wall. A board slid through those loops would turn the landing into another barricade. It wouldn't stop people with sledgehammers in time, but it would keep grabbing hands and snapping teeth from reaching us right away. When the hardware was in place, we talked about rules. Saying them out loud made it easier to commit to them. First rule, we didn't open the tower door for anyone without taking time to think. No quick mercy, no just a second. If someone pounded on the metal, we watched from higher up, asked questions, and gave ourselves a buffer zone to be wrong. Second rule, one of us was always responsible for the stairs. If one of us went down to the base to check the door, the other stayed on the landing with a clear view and a clear path farther up. No wandering off in opposite directions. Third rule, absolute noise discipline. The bells hung above us in their frame, massive and silent. If a storm hit or the tower shook, those clappers could swing and ring out, alerting the whole area. We didn't just trust luck. I climbed up into the frame with a handful of rags and some cord. I wrapped the heavy iron clappers in cloth and tied them tight against the side of the bells so metal couldn't touch metal. Now, even if the wind howled, the tower would stay silent. No accidents, no tests. We wrote the rules in one of Ria's notebooks and taped the page to the wall by our landing. It felt a little formal, maybe even stupid with just the two of us there, but it also turned the stair into our space instead of just another part of an abandoned building. If we added more people later, they would see the list before they saw us. When we finished the first round of work, we sat on the steps and listened. The city sounded farther away now. There were fewer sirens, no horns, just the wind and the occasional dull impact from somewhere we couldn't see. This was the first time in my life I had ever fortified a building to keep the world out, rather than fixing it to let people in. We didn't know if the tower was strong enough or if the rules would hold up when fear and hunger started pushing on them. We only knew that this was our ground, and that leaving it now would mean starting from scratch somewhere much more exposed. Winter didn't pull its punches just because we had climbed into a stone tower. The cold seeped through the masonry and the metal door anyway, a heavy, bone-chilling weight that settled in our lungs. By the second morning, it was clear that coats and blankets were only going to slow the freeze down, not stop it. If we wanted to last until a thaw, we needed real heat, and a way to control it without burning the place down or signaling every living thing within 5 miles. I told Ria about an old cast-iron stove I had seen in a side storage room off the main hall, left there years ago when the parish updated the heating system. I said, if it's still there and the flue is clear, we can bring it up one level and keep it directly under us. It'll heat the stone floor. She looked toward the stairs, calculating the risk, and said we would go once in broad daylight and come back with anything that helped us stay warm and dry. But we wouldn't make a second trip. We waited for the brightest part of the day, high noon, then went to the base of the tower and listened at the door until the silence felt real. The service hall on the other side was empty. The main church sat cold and still, rows of benches stretching into the gloom, tall stained glass windows dull without the sun hitting them directly. There was a stripe of snow under a cracked pane, but no bodies and no movement. In the side room, the stove was exactly where I remembered it, buried under extra chairs and folding tables, heavy, ugly, but solid, with a short section of flue pipe still bolted into the brick chimney. Ria ran her hand along the mortar joints, checked for cracks, and said it looked like it would draft properly for now, and that was all the inspection we were going to get. Wrestling that iron beast into the tower was the worst part of the week. The stair was narrow and steep, and the stove was dead weight with no good place to grab. We cleared a path, laid a heavy wool blanket under it to protect the stone, and dragged it to the foot of the steps. From there, we moved it one riser at a time, me pulling on a rope rigged from above and Ria pushing from below, stopping every few steps to gasp for air and adjust our grip. By the time we reached the service level just under our sleeping landing, our arms were shaking and our backs were screaming, but the stove was where we needed it. We set it on a bed of spare floor tiles to catch any sparks, tied it to the iron railing so it wouldn't slide, and hooked it into the old flue access we found behind a loose panel. Fuel came from the only source we could reach without walking into town, the church itself. The back benches were thick oak, seasoned for decades and older than both of us. We picked 2 farthest from the doors, checked the floor around them for bloodstains or drag marks, then broke them down with a sledgehammer and a short pry bar. Every crack of the wood echoed more than I liked, putting our nerves on edge, but nothing moved in the shadows. We carried the splintered pieces into the tower and stacked them by the stove. The first fire felt like a test we couldn't afford to fail. We needed heat, but we didn't need a beacon. I told Ria, this wood is bone dry. It should burn hot and clean, very little white smoke. We lit it small. The smoke drafted perfectly into the pipe instead of our faces, and after a few minutes, the air near the stove felt different, lighter, drier, compared to the damp chill by the stairs. Before we relaxed, we agreed on a hard rule. The fire would only burn when one of us sat with it, preferably at night or during high wind to disperse any haze, and never while we both slept. Water came next. The tap in the small janitor's closet by the service hall gave one short brown cough of sludge and then nothing. That was the end of easy options. Outside, snow lay thick on the field and on the stone ledges around the church. It was the only clean source we could see. We kept 2 galvanized buckets by the tower door. Whenever one of us went down to check the base security, we brought back a load of fresh snow, dropped it in a dented pot on top of the stove, and waited. It was a slow process. A full bucket of fluffy snow melted down into just a few inches of water. Once it boiled hard for a full 5 minutes, we poured it into jars and bottles, marking the safe ones with a strip of blue tape. Food turned into a numbers game. We laid our entire stockpile on the landing floor, counted every item, and Rhea wrote it all down in the log. Canned soup, beans, a few tins of vegetables, a bag of rice, dried pasta, a little peanut butter, and some candy bars we had grabbed without thinking. We circled anything that required a long boil time and saved it for days when the stove was already running hot for heat. Breakfast slid into lunch and became one small meal, then we ate again near dark. It felt wrong to go to bed with a hollow stomach, but it felt worse to picture the shelves empty in 2 weeks. Seeing the hard numbers in the notebook made it easier to put the spoon down when it was time. The last problem was the one everyone pretends they can ignore in the movies until it becomes urgent. The tower didn't have plumbing we could trust, and our bodies weren't going to wait for the city to fix the sewer lines. The dead restroom near the base was off our secure route and tied to pipes we didn't want to test. On the level below the stove, we found a small, windowless pocket of space, just stone walls and a low ceiling. We cleared out the junk boxes and set up a heavy plastic bucket there, lined with thick contractor bags we found in a closet. After each use, we added a scoop of wood ash from the stove to cut the smell and absorb moisture. When a bag filled, we tied it off airtight. Once a day, whoever had door duty carried the tied bag down the stairs, eased the tower door open, and walked it out past the low wall. We picked a spot on the far side of the building where the ground dropped away into a steep ravine, well away from the clean snow drifts we used for water. It wasn't pretty work, but it kept the tower clean and disease-free. Within a week, we had a routine that almost felt like a schedule. Check the door and the first turns of the stairs. Feed the stove in short bursts with dry oak, melt snow, boil water, split and stack wood. Wipe down the rail and floor, eat slowly, watch the thin slice of street we could see from our window, and then sleep in short stretches, trading off listening duty when the dark settled in. On the 8th day in the tower, the silence broke. We had gotten used to the wind whistling through the stonework and the distant wet thud of snow falling from the roof, but this was different. It was a new sound at the base of the tower, distinct and deliberate. It wasn't the scratching of a branch or the mindless battering of the infected. It was a tight rhythmic pattern. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. It was too even to be one of the dead who just threw themselves at noise, but it was too patient to be someone in a full-blown panic. I went to the landing immediately above the door, while Rhea moved higher up the spiral with a clear line of sight to the stairs below. We had already agreed on the protocol for this. If anyone came close, I would be the voice, and she would be the eyes watching for any movement I missed or any weapon drawn in the shadows. From the narrow slit window directly over the base, I looked down. I saw a man standing just outside the tower door, shivering slightly. He was wearing a heavy canvas coat, a bright orange municipal safety vest over it, and a thick knit cap. Snow dusted his shoulders. His hands were held out from his sides, fingers spread wide like he wanted us to see they were empty. Slung over his back, muzzle pointing down, was an old woodstock hunting rifle. The kind you see in gun racks in pickup trucks, not a police issue. I waited until he knocked the exact same way again. 3 hits, a pause, 3 hits. Then I raised my voice just enough for it to carry through the cold stone and said, "Step back from the door. Take 2 big steps back, keep your hands where I can see them, and don't touch that rifle on your back." He flinched at the sound of a voice coming from the rock, but he didn't run. He stepped back, lifted his palms higher to show he wasn't reaching for the strap, and said, "Name's Hank. City Services. If this is the church on the edge of the district, you've seen my plow go by 100 times." Rhea shifted her weight on the stair above me. I heard the metal of the railing creak softly and knew she was ready to drop something heavy or signal me to back off. I kept my eyes locked on him through the slit and said, "You're at the church tower. If you really work for the city, tell me which yard your trucks sleep in and what exactly is posted on the main gate." He let out a long white breath that clouded the air, looked up toward the window and said, "North Yard, right by the train tracks. There's a big blue public works sign, and underneath it is a smaller white one that says no public dumping, which nobody ever reads because the ditch is full of mattresses." It matched what I knew perfectly, right down to the mattresses, but in a world like this, one right answer wasn't enough to open the only door between us and the cold. I checked the hallway beyond the tower door through the other view slit. There was no second shape lurking in the service hall, no long shadows pressed flat along the wall waiting to rush us. Outside, the snow showed one clear, solitary trail of heavy boot prints coming in from the side road and stopping right at the door. There were no extra tracks fanning out to flank us, no drag marks from supplies or bodies, and no place for someone else to crouch close enough to ambush me. If this was a trap, it was a very thin one. He shifted his weight from one frozen foot to the other, careful, like he knew sudden moves were a bad idea when someone was watching from above. He looked at the stone and said, "I saw smoke from this direction 3 nights in a row. Not much, just a thin gray line near dusk, like someone who knows how to hide a fire but can't hide it all. Everything else out here either blazes out of control or stays dark. I figured this was either a smart camp or a bad surprise, and I was out of better options." I listened to the cadence of his voice. It was slow, tired, and flat. The sound of exhaustion, not the jumpy, aggressive tone of someone looking for a fight. I asked the standard question, the one that mattered more than the rest. "How long since you were bitten, scratched, or covered in anyone else's blood?" He answered without a second of hesitation and said, "No bite, no scratch. And the only blood on me is from splitting my knuckles on a frozen plow frame 3 days ago. My partner went down 2 days ago and stayed down. If I thought I was next, I'd walk away from a stone box, not toward it." That lined up with what I saw in his face when he lifted his head toward my voice. There were deep lines from the cold and not enough sleep, but no fever sheen, no glassy, vacant stare of the infection taking hold. I still wasn't ready to open the door, though. I told him, "Turn a slow circle with your hands up, then kneel down, put the rifle on the ground in front of you and pull your sleeves back to your elbows." He followed every step without arguing. He unslung the rifle slowly, laid it in the snow, and rolled up his heavy coat sleeves. His skin was pale and raw from the biting wind, but clean. No bandages, no fresh cuts, no black veins. When he stood up and faced the tower again, he said, "You're right to check. I'd do the same. But listen, I know where the city keeps the things you're going to wish you had if you plan on sitting tight through this winter. Sand, salt, lumber, pipe, fuel. All of it is stacked in the maintenance yards with nobody left to lock the sheds." That got Ria's attention. I heard her lean closer behind me, her breathing changing pattern. The stairwell suddenly felt tighter. Supplies meant survival. I asked which way he had come in to get to the door. He said he had stayed off the main road completely, cut through the back lanes he used on his early morning plow runs, and stuck to the low side of the hill where the houses thinned out. He described the last corner before the church, the dip in the pavement where the storm drain always clogged with ice, and the old oak tree that leaned over the intersection so far the city crew had to trim it every single fall. It all matched my own memory of that route in perfect detail. I told Ria I was going down and that if anything felt wrong, even for a second, she should set the landing bar and move higher up. Then I went to the base. I slid the spare cabinet panel across the inner curve of the stair first, so I had something solid between me and the door if it blew in with force. Only then did I pull the heavy bar from the tower door. I kept the safety chain on and opened it just enough, maybe 3 inches, to see him straight without giving him a gap to push through. Up close, he looked the same as he had from the window, just more worn. A little older than me, deep crow's feet at the eyes, a beard coming in uneven and gray from days without a razor. I kept one hand tight on the chain, my boot braced against the door, and said, "This is the last chance to be straight with me. Once this chain drops, there's no going back." Hank stood just inside the tower door, shaking the snow off his boots with his pack on the floor and his hands held open at chest height. I kept my shoulder pressed against the stone wall and said, "Last chance. Anything you didn't say outside, say it now before we lock this back up." He met my eyes and answered, "No bites, no one hiding outside waiting for a signal, and no plan to take this place from you. I'm cold, I'm out of options, and I know where the city keeps the sand, boards, and hardware you need to survive. That's the whole pitch." It was as clean as I was going to get from a stranger in a dead city. I slid the chain back into its slot, dropped the heavy bar into place with a solid clank, and said, "All right. Grab your pack, leave the rifle slung until I say otherwise, and come up slow. Keep your hands where we can see them." On the landing, Rhea had the stove running low and the heavy iron poker resting close to her hand. She watched Hank climb into view, her eyes tracking every movement, and said, "Stop right there, away from our packs." He stopped instantly. I stepped up behind him and said, "This is Hank. He worked for city services before the collapse." Hank eased his pack down, unzipped the top with stiff fingers, and pulled out 3 cans of beef stew and a folded laminated map. He held up the map, smoothed it against the stone wall, and said, "Red circles are the maintenance yards with sand and lumber. Blue crosses are places I already saw go bad. Hospitals, police precincts, the mall." That was more tactical detail than most people would give up front, and it matched what I knew about how the city stored its emergency supplies. Rhea kept the stove between them, not ready to relax yet, and asked, "What does go bad mean now? Are we talking sick people or armed people?" Hank warmed his frozen fingers over the cast iron and said, "Both. Main roads are locked tight with abandoned cars and bodies. Side streets are quiet until a sound rolls through, and then the slow ones drift in like a tide. But the climbers are worse. I watched one run across a row of garage roofs and clear a 6-foot fence without slowing down. They moved like they practiced for this." I didn't need more of that mental picture. The tower suddenly felt less like a strange choice and more like our only good one. We went over the rules immediately. I pointed at the page taped to the wall and said, "If you stay, this applies to you. Same food rations, same work shifts, same watch schedule. Nobody opens the door or heads down the stairs without saying it out loud first." Hank read to the bottom, squinting in the dim light, then tapped an empty corner of the page and said, "Add one more. Nobody goes outside alone unless we all agree it's worth the risk. I've locked too many gates behind guys who went for a quick run and never came back." Rhea took the pen, wrote it in, tore a strip of tape to secure the corner, and said, "Fine. You get the same share and the same blame if things go wrong." Once his hands stopped shaking from the warmth, Hank looked critically at the stone around the stairwell and the narrow window below our landing. He shook his head and said, "You guys are dragging firewood and supplies up these spiral steps like movers. Spiral stairs are for people, not dead weight. You keep that up and your backs will blow out before the door does." I crossed my arms and said, "We took what we could reach without walking deep into town. Being close was better than nothing." He nodded but pointed at the window and said, "Close isn't smart if you break a leg doing it. You hang a steel bracket above that window, run a rope and a pulley through it, and you can haul boards and heavy bags straight up from the ground outside. Less time near the doors. Fewer chances for something to grab you in the dark." Rhea pressed her palm to the wall, listened to the tone of the stone, and said, "He's right. This section can take a load if we spread it properly." We went down to the storage level and dug through shelves I had barely looked at back when this was just another building on my route. Behind a dusty canvas tarp, we found a heavy steel wall bracket and a box of long masonry anchors. Old stock from some facade upgrade that never happened. Back on the stair under the window, Rhea marked 3 spots. Hank turned the small hand drill until his shoulders shook with the effort. and I set the anchors with the driver until they seated deep in the stone. When I clipped our best climbing rope through the bracket and leaned my full weight into it to test the hold, nothing moved but my boots sliding on the dust. Hank wiped sweat and soot from his forehead with his wrist and said, "Good. Now this place has more than just luck holding it together." That night I spread Hank's map on the floor between us. I pointed at the nearest red circle, the yard by the railroad tracks, and said, "Can we reach this one without touching the main road?" Hank traced a thin, winding line with his finger and said, "If we cut behind these row houses and use the utility alleys, yes. When I came through 2 days ago, the gate was sagging and the yard was quiet." Rhea watched his hand moving over the map and said, "You two go. I stay here, keep the stove low, and keep the door shut. Someone has to be on this side to work the lock if it goes bad." I looked at her and told her, "If we're not back by dark, you stop waiting and run this place like we never left." She nodded once, her face hard, and said, "Then don't be stupid. Come back before dark." We left in the gray, flat light of early morning, moved behind the empty houses, and stayed away from open corners. The maintenance yard sat behind a chain-link fence with the gate half off its hinges. Plows and salt spreaders sat in silent rows covered in snow. There were no engines running and no voices. We skipped the office building entirely, too many corners, and went straight to the sheds. We loaded a low steel cart with heavy sandbags, 3 pressure-treated boards, and a crate of galvanized screws, leaving the neat line of fuel cans alone for a future run. The trip back was slow and heavy, the cart wheels crunching on the ice. Every patch of open ground felt like a bad idea waiting to happen, but nothing followed us up the hill. Rhea opened the side service door as soon as our special knock hit the wood, and she shut it fast behind the cart. We rolled it to the base of the tower right under the window with the new bracket. We clipped each sandbag to the rope and split the work. Hank handled the clips at the bottom, I hauled the rope from the stair, and Rhea pulled each load through the window and stacked it. By the time we stopped the first turn in the stair, our fatal funnel had a waist-high wall of sandbags you could kneel behind and fire over. Our sleeping landing now had real teeth instead of just talk. We were dug in. Fresh snow wiped the slate clean every morning, hiding our old footprints and making the street below look abandoned. Our days settled into a grim loop. Check the door seals, feed the stove with small slivers of oak, hoist supplies through the window, and listen to the wind. 3 people filled the tower comfortably, but it still felt like our space, a tight unit with a rhythm we understood. That changed the morning. A 4th voice came from outside, not with a knock, but with a hail. The sound came up through the stone in short, steady bursts, projected by someone who knew how to make their voice carry without screaming. I went to the narrow window over the base immediately. Hank moved to the sandbag wall at the first turn of the stairs, leveling his rifle on the door. Rhea stayed higher up, ready to signal. Below, a single man stood a few meters from the tower door. He was wearing a long wool coat and a thick scarf, white hair spilling out from under a hat. His hands raised clearly with palms open. When he saw movement in the slit window, he took 2 slow, deliberate steps back and said, "If anyone is in there, I'm clean. I'm alone and I'm not armed." I scanned the road behind him. The fresh snow showed a single set of tracks coming in from the direction of the town square with nothing flanking it. I kept my voice flat and said, "Stay exactly where you are and keep your hands up." He raised them higher, exposing his wrists, and said, "My name is Elias Ward. I used to run this parish back when people still came here on purpose to pray, not just to hide." Hank shifted his weight behind the sandbags, lowered the rifle barrel slightly, and whispered, "That's him. That's Father Elias." I didn't lower my guard. I asked the standard list, "How long since you were bitten, scratched, or covered in anyone else's blood?" Elias answered, "No bites, no scratches. The only blood on me is from my own nose when I took a spill on the ice 2 days ago. I've been alone in the rectory since the worst of it started. If I were turning, I doubt I'd have the patience to stand here and talk this long." I told him to turn a full, slow circle with his hands high, then pull his coat sleeves back and show his forearms. He moved slowly, stiff from the cold. His skin looked thin like parchment, but it was clean. No black veins, no bandages. When he faced the tower again, he looked up at the slit and said, "I know every room, closet, and crawl space in this church. I didn't expect anyone to be smart enough to take the tower, but if you are, we might as well stop yelling through 3 feet of stone." Rhea leaned on the rail above me, her voice low. If we let him in, we stop being a couple with a friend and become a committee. Taking Hank had been a calculated risk that paid off. Taking an old man felt like charity, but Hank nodded at me from the stairs. I watched Elias a little longer and said, "If you come in, you follow the rules posted on the wall and you do your share of the work. No guests, no freeloaders." He bowed his head slightly and said, "That is fair. I'm asking for a corner, not a crown." At the base, I slid our spare cabinet panel across the inner curve of the stair, our secondary breach shield, and kept one hand near the heavy bar while I opened the tower door with the safety chain still engaged. Up close, he looked even older than he had from above, deep lines etched into his face, but his eyes were clear and sharp. I said, "If you feel sick even a little, you tell us first. If you hide it, we put you back outside and lock this door behind you." Elias met my gaze and answered, "If I feel the kind of sick you fear, I will ask you to let me go myself. I have no desire to hurt the last living people I might ever see." We brought him up to the landing. The tower suddenly felt smaller. The air was tighter with one more body breathing in it. Rhea pointed at the rules taped to the stone and said, "Read that before you sit down." Elias read each line, nodding slowly, and said, "You show more sense than the poor souls who tried to pack the school gym. I watched that from my window. It ended fast and it ended badly." When we asked where he had been, he said he had stayed with a few families in the rectory until the visits from police stopped. Then he locked the doors and watched the road go quiet. "After that, I saw your smoke 3 mornings in a row," he said, warming his hands on a mug of hot water Rhea handed him. Thin and straight, barely visible against the gray sky. But I saw it. That hit me hard. We thought we were invisible. Rhea looked at me, then at the stove. Elias wrapped his hands tighter around the cup and said, "Don't worry, most people aren't looking up, but I offer what I know. There are storage closets off the back hall you likely missed, a low crawl space under the choir loft, and a small rainwater cistern under the rectory kitchen that may still hold ice or water. I also remember exactly which houses on this block belong to people who bragged about their well-stocked basements." Hank raised an eyebrow, impressed. "So you're our guide for the neighborhood?" Elias shook his head and said, "I'm just someone who listened for 30 years while people talked about their lives. If that intel helps you hold this tower, I'm glad to trade it for a warm corner." We cleared a spot for him on the level below ours, giving him a mat and a blanket. After he settled in, I took the pen and added one more line to the rules sheet. Food, fuel, new people, and any trip outside needs at least 2 of us to agree. When I taped the page back up, Rhea read it and said, "We're a group now, whether we like the word or not." Hank nodded, checking the action on his rifle. Elias looked at the stone walls and said, 4 people and 1 narrow way up. If we stay honest with each other, this tower might actually carry us through the winter." Elias was the first to catch the sound of them coming. It was early morning, the sun barely scraping over the horizon when he pressed his ear to the cold stone near the narrow slit window. He listened for a long moment, eyes closed, and said, "Voices on the lower access road, at least 4 of them. They're loud, they're arguing, and they aren't trying to hide." I joined him at the wall, straining to hear over the wind. It was faint, but it was there. The clatter of metal on metal, rough laughter, and a man's voice yelling something about clearing the next block before noon. Rhea traced a line on the map with her fingernail and said, "If they stay on that street, they hit the church service road in 5 minutes. Hank looked at the empty field covered in snow and said, Then we have to decide right now if this tower is something we defend or something we cut bait and run from the second someone points a finger at it. Running wasn't on the table. We had the only defensible stair in town, a working heat source and a water supply. Meeting them outside would throw all those advantages away and put us in a fair fight, which was the last thing we wanted. We set one hard rule for the encounter. I would talk once. If they pushed after that, we would treat them like anything else hitting the door, a threat to be neutralized. Hank laid spare rounds on the sandbags at the first turn and checked the action on his rifle. Rhea took the hall window to watch our flank. Elias stayed on the stair with one hand on the rail, acting as our relay. They arrived in the afternoon, a group of 4 figures in heavy, mismatched coats walking straight up the center of the road like they owned the pavement. One carried a pump-action shotgun, another had a short carbine rifle, and the other 2 held baseball bats and wore heavy backpacks. The tall one in the lead stopped at the foot of the main steps, looked up and shouted, "We saw the smoke trail and the boarded-up glass. We know somebody's nesting up there." I called down from the tower slit, keeping my head well back from the opening, and said, "Place is full. We have nothing for you. Keep moving." He turned his head toward the sound of my voice, shielding his eyes, and said, "We cleared 3 houses and a convenience store to get here. We're not walking past a stone box just because some ghost in a window says no." He laughed once, a sharp, ugly sound in the cold air, and said, "Here's how it works. You open up, hand over your guns, and let us search the place. If you cooperate, we keep the tower, and you get to stay in the sanctuary under us if you behave. If you don't, we drag you out." There was nothing in that offer we could survive. I shouted back, "Not happening. This is your last warning. Take your people and walk away while that's still your choice." He spat into the snow, waved his people forward, and cut toward the side of the building. One of the men with a bat flipped a shotgun into his hands from a sling and jogged toward the service door, the one we actually used. Inside the tower, the air grew heavy. Hank lay prone behind the wall of sandbags at the first turn, his cheek pressed against the wooden stock of his rifle. "Say the word," he muttered. We listened for our secret knock, but it didn't come. What hit the tower door was a kick. The metal skin rang out like a gong, then again, harder. I said, "If they hit it a 3rd time, we answer." The next impact was a full-body slam against the push bar, trying to force the lock mechanism. Hank didn't hesitate. He fired a single round into the stone lintel just above the door frame. In the enclosed stone tube, the shot was deafening. It turned the stairwell into a drum vibrating in our chests. Outside, boots scrambled on the concrete landing and someone swore loudly in panic. They answered with their own fire almost immediately. A slug smashed into the tower door, tearing through the outer metal skin but lodging in the wood core. Another shot went wide, flew through the slit window and chipped the inner curve of the stair wall, spraying stone dust and spalling concrete across the steps. Rhea called out from the upper hall window that one of them had taken cover behind the front steps and another was working his way toward the big main doors. They were treating the church like an empty shell they could breach at leisure, not like a fortress with people already dug in. The gunfire did exactly what we feared. It rang the dinner bell. Through the slit, I saw slow gray shapes turning in from the lower road and starting toward the church, drawn by the echo. The tall leader waved them off with his hand like they were stray dogs. They kept coming. Hank stayed locked in at the stair bend, calm as ice, and said, "If they breach the door and get inside, don't shoot high. Aim for the legs. The stone walls can eat whatever they send back, but ricochets will kill us if we aren't careful." None of us had fired on living people before. The first time a head and shoulders crossed the narrow slice of the side yard view, Hank tracked the movement. He didn't go for the kill. He aimed for the meat of the thigh and squeezed the trigger. The man outside screamed, a high, human sound that cut through the ringing in our ears, dropped his shotgun and crawled frantically for the cover of the concrete steps, leaving a bright red smear on the snow. Meanwhile, more walkers drifted in from both sides of the road, all angling toward the noise. A climber came last, running in from farther down the hill. It vaulted a parked car, slipped on a patch of black ice, scrambled up again on all fours, and went straight for the loudest, most active spot, the cluster of attackers at the front steps. From the window, we watched it hit the group. For a few chaotic seconds, the tall man and one of his crew tried to push it off with the butts of their guns, screaming at it. While they were distracted, two of the slow walkers reached the same place and turned the fight into a frantic, bloody pile. One of the strangers broke first. He abandoned his cover and ran for the road, firing his pistol backward without aiming. Hank tracked him through the slit for a second, then lowered the barrel. "Let him go," he said. "He's finally moving in the right direction." The others tried to drag the wounded man clear, but they got pulled down by the weight of the dead. The tall leader fired twice more at the tower out of pure, impotent anger, his shot sparking uselessly off the granite. Then he backed toward the side street, his eyes wide and fixed on the stone that wouldn't open. The climber made the final call. It tore loose from the pile of bodies and went after the only target still on his feet. The last we saw of the tall man was his heavy coat vanishing between two houses, with the climber sprinting close behind him. The lot in front of the church settled into a slow, ugly motion as the dead closed in on what was left of the attackers. The gunfire stopped, replaced by wet, tearing sounds. Inside, we stayed away from the windows and let the echoes fade. The air in the stairwell stank of burned powder and old dust. My hands shook enough that I had to set the spare ammunition box down on the floor. Hank kept his cheek welded to the stock of his rifle for another full minute before he sat up and said, "The door held. The sandbags held. We're still here." Elias gripped the iron rail, his knuckles white, and said, "We never invited them. They chose this. They forced the hand." Rhea sat on the landing, breathing hard, and said, "Next time someone points a gun at our walls and smiles, remember today." When the only sounds left were the wind and the distant shuffling of feet in the snow, we went down to check the damage. The tower door was dented and scarred, but still solid on its hinges. One slug had punched through and buried itself in the sandbags at shin level. Fresh chips marked the stone where wild shots had hit high. From the window, the yard looked worse than the day we arrived, with more bodies and more dark stains in the snow. But the tower was sealed. That night, by the light of the stove, we wrote one more line on the rule sheet and taped it over the empty corner. If a group comes with guns already out and orders on their lips, we do not bargain a second time. The tower was still ours because we treated it as something worth fighting for, not something we would trade to the first voice that shouted threats from the ground. The morning after the fight, the tower felt heavier. The physical space hadn't changed. The same cast iron stove ticked and pinged as it cooled down. The same wind pushed around the external stone, but the air inside sat different. It was thicker, charged with something we couldn't just vent out. We had fired on living people, not just the animated dead, and they had not taken the stare. That fact shifted the ground under our feet. It meant this place was more than just a temporary shelter now. It was ground we had chosen to hold, and we had paid for it in nerves and gunpowder. Rhea boiled water on the stove and passed steaming mugs around. Nobody spoke for a long time. Hank sat with his back pressed against the sandbags he had built, his rifle resting across his knees, staring at the boots he hadn't taken off in 24 hours. Elias stood near the slit window, head cocked, listening to the wind and the groans from the yard below. Once our hands stopped shaking enough to be useful, we walked the tower like it was a job site. Hank and I started at the door, the point of impact. The metal skin had bowed inward like a punched stomach where the slug hit. But the hinges were straight and the frame was still tight against the masonry. The sand behind the impact point was dark and clumped from absorbing the energy. I scraped a pocket out of the bag so any new rounds would have fresh room to sink without passing through. On the stair bend, the sandbags felt firm. They hadn't shifted under the recoil or the vibration. The boards across our sleeping landing had stayed put. Rhea tapped each wall anchor with the back of a wrench, listening to the ping of the steel, and said, "Nothing slipped." The tower did exactly what we asked it to do. Elias rubbed his face, looking tired in the gray light, and said, You talk like this is a renovation project. She answered without looking up. It is. Projects can be checked and engineered, luck can't. I'd rather trust the bolts. Outside, the yard in front of the church had turned into a horror show. The gunfire had acted like a dinner bell, pulling in more dead from the surrounding blocks. Now slow, gray shapes drifted aimlessly between the frozen bodies of the attackers. We set a new rule immediately. Short looks only. You checked the perimeter for threats, but you didn't stare. If they were wandering away from the doors, that was enough. Staring at the mess too long ate away at your morale. Inside, the tension didn't fully break. Hank kept glancing at the same slice of wall, replaying the shot. Ria's pen shook when she tried to mark the food log for the morning ration. We didn't pretend we were fine. That afternoon, we sat on the landing with the stove burning low to save fuel. I broke the silence and said, they had more people, they had heavy coats, and they had guns. We had one narrow stair, a wall of sandbags, and a plan. The plan worked. Nobody on our side caught around. That matters more than how ugly it looked. Hank nodded once, a sharp jerk of his chin, and said, next time someone shoulders a gun at our door, we don't wait for the first shot. We answer first. We define the engagement. Ria shook her head, looking at the map, and said, we also need to see people sooner. I want them spotted at the end of the road, not when they're already under the windows. We need to clear the sightlines. Elias listened to all of us, then tapped the notebook sitting on the crate and said, you did what you had to do, but it will still sit in your heads, rattling around. Write it down, not for anyone else to read, but for you. When you can read the reasons on paper, they move less in the dark. That night, I added a new section at the back of the logbook for hard calls. Short, brutal lines. What happened, what we chose to do, and what it cost us. When the damage checks were done, we talked about the part none of us had said out loud yet. Until that day, some corner of my mind still held a fantasy list of other options. The maintenance yard, a bigger municipal building, maybe some refugee camp outside town if the radio ever came back on. 4 armed strangers at our door burned that list to ash. Any place we moved to now would start weaker than this one and would eventually draw the same kind of desperate people once it showed signs of life. Ria stood at the window watching the dead houses and the strip of highway in the distance and said, there is nothing near us that beats this setup. We have height, 1 stair, 3 feet of stone, and space for heat and storage. If we walk away now, all we do is start from zero, somewhere softer, somewhere we can't defend. Hank set his rifle beside him, leaned back, and said, then this isn't a hideout anymore, it's home base. Everything else is just a supply run. We went through what that shift meant for us. It meant we would use the rope and bracket hoist whenever we could to save energy, not just when we were desperate. We would pick a few nearby houses and strip them slowly and methodically, taking tools, blankets, and cans. We would add more sheet metal around the stove so one bad coal couldn't turn the stairwell into a chimney fire. We would move some of the bulk storage up a level so we weren't sleeping on top of every supply we owned. It also meant deciding what to do the next time someone came without a weapon already raised. Elias looked at us and said, if you close the tower for good, seal it up tight. You are choosing to let whoever comes next die on the steps. That choice sits on your chest like any bullet. Hank answered, but if we open for everyone who can still walk and talk, this stair turns into a funnel. We get overcrowded, hygiene fails, tempers flare. One mistake later and we all go down together. Ria looked at the space and said, then we set a number. A hard cap that this place can hold, and we don't move it when it hurts. We treated the tower capacity like any other maintenance job and measured it with our eyes. The level above the stove could take 2 more sleeping mats if we stacked the crates higher against the wall. The level below could hold 1 extra bed in a corner if we moved the water storage. Any more than that, and every step would mean climbing over someone. 8 was the number that fit, 4 of us plus room for 4 more. I wrote it into the rules and into the log in bold ink. Capacity, 8. If we ever reached 8, anyone else who came would get water, and if we could spare it, some food passed through the door, but not a bed in the stair. That night, I marked the day in the log as the point where we stopped thinking in terms of until the rescue comes and started thinking in terms of as long as we are here. At the bottom of the page, I wrote one line: if we leave now, we are weaker anywhere else. The days that followed were quiet, sharp, and hyper-focused. We patched the inside of the door with a scrap steel plate we scavenged. Hank added a second rope through the pulley bracket so we could pull 2 light loads instead of 1 heavy one. Rhea rechecked every knot and anchor point daily. Elias spent his time walking the window levels, using a pair of binoculars to mark houses that might hold something worth the risk. Curtains drawn, no broken glass, no tracks to the door. Through all of it, the idea that this was the only safe place in town stopped being a comforting line and turned into a work order. It was safe because it had stone and height, yes, but it was safe because 4 people kept checking bolts, sharing food rations, watching each other for cracks in the armor, and writing down the hard choices instead of burying them. It would stay safe only as long as we kept doing those things. There was no finish date on that work, just another morning in the same stairwell and the same decision to hold it one more day. We never hung a sign out front, but that stone tower became our answer to every new problem the world threw at us. When the cold bit harder in January, we didn't just shiver. We cut more seasoned oak and fed the stove. When the food stocks ran low, we didn't panic. We planned distinct scavenging runs and came back slow and heavy. When strangers pushed at our perimeter, we didn't negotiate. We used the spiral stair, the sandbags, and the fatal funnel to send a message that couldn't be misunderstood. The place worked not because it was magic, but because we treated it like a machine that could fail any day if we stopped paying attention to the maintenance. Looking back now, I know the building didn't save us on its own. The sheer stone walls and the height gave us an edge, sure, but they only mattered because we kept the door barred, the rules written on the wall in plain sight, and our eyes open. I had spent years of my life fixing wiring, breaker panels, and streetlights without thinking much about the structures that sat around them. Up in that tower, I learned that the structure you pick matters just as much as the tools in your hand. You can't fix a bad location with good intentions. You might never see a tower like this. You might be listening to this in a suburban house, a second-floor apartment, a single-wide trailer, or a room above a bodega. The shape of the shelter changes, but the work stays exactly the same. Pick a place you can actually hold. Find a spot with 1 or 2 doors you can watch constantly, not 10 exits you just hope stay shut. Find walls that stop more than just the wind. Figure out a way to get your heat, your water, and your waste under control before those things turn on you. Once you pick your ground, learn it cold. Walk every corner of your perimeter while you still can. Count the steps in the dark, test the locks, find out which floorboards creak so you know when someone is moving. Fix the things you can reach with a hammer and nails. Block off the blind spots that only make trouble. Write down your rules and put them where you have to look at them every single morning. And don't try to be the lone wolf. That guy burns out fast and makes bad calls when the fatigue sets in. A few people with clear, defined jobs can keep a place standing when everything else falls. In our tower, I watched the wiring and the door. Rhea watched the structural integrity. Hank watched the roads and the sight lines. Elias watched the people inside the walls to keep us from cracking. The dead are one kind of threat, and eventually they just become background noise. The real killers are cold, hunger, and panic. We lived through the first wave of both because we treated every day like a test we were terrified to fail. We checked each other for bites, sure, but we also checked for bad judgment. We told the truth when we were scared or tired instead of pretending to be fine. If you're listening to this with a roof over your head and a door you can lock, you already have a head start. Look around the place you're sitting in right now. Ask yourself what would break first if things got worse tomorrow. Ask what you can change now while things are still normal. You don't need a church tower. You just need one spot you understand better than anything outside it. If this story helped you think about your own tower, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who checks the exits when they walk into a room. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from and what place you'd turn into your safe spot. Stay warm, stay alert, and don't wait for someone else to make the hard call for you.